In this video you're going to find out exactly how I built these 40k inspired shipping containers. You're going to need my templates, some glues, some filler, piece of foam core, some knives and pins and some chipboard. I haven't cut these details out yet, these are for the ribs and the feet, but we'll do that at the very end. The first thing we need to do is take these 3 octagons and glue them to the piece of foam core. These will provide the internal structure for the entire build. Make sure they're well stuck, flat, stick something heavy on top to dry if necessary. These need to be as accurate as possible. Cut them out with a really sharp knife. You need to get as clean a cut as you can. Once you've got those cut out, you're going to need to turn your attention to all the larger pieces on the template and grab yourself a drawing pin. You'll notice some markings on these pieces, we're going to use them later, but for now, grab the pin, push a couple of holes in the big pieces, in between the markings on the outside of these parts. We're going to use these holes as guides when we come to gluing and pinning the bulk of the main structure together. Get your PVA glue out and grab yourself a bunch of pins because we're going to start gluing the structure together. We need a little bit of glue on the octagon and then we're going to line the first piece up so that the octagon fits inside the markings on the larger pieces from the template. And like I said, we're going to use those guide holes to pin everything in place. Then it is a case of rinse and repeat. Before we add the 4th side, now is the time to use that 3rd octagon, which we are going to place right in the center of this structure to give it that extra piece of strength so we can safely put models on top when it's finished. Once we've added the 4th big side, we can add the smaller pieces until it looks like this. At this point you want to pick a top and a bottom of the shipping container so you know what you're working with, and then grab yourself all of these pieces. I'm switching to wood glue rather than standard PVA at this point because it sets up much quicker. We're going to add 2 of these long thin strips to everywhere the side panels of the container meet. This is where those markings on those panels start to come into play. These pieces will fit perfectly between the 2 outer markings, and I'm going to use a ruler just to make sure that they're perfectly straight, because if you glue a wonky one it's going to look weird. Once they're all glued in place it's going to look like this and we can start to fill in some of the gaps. Grab yourself an old pair of snips, the wider, long, thin pieces from the template, and we're simply just going to cut to fit to fill in all of the gaps where the markings are on the panels of the container. There is plenty of them to do, so you better get your finger out. But by then you'll have the base structure of this shipping container complete. Next we're going to start the setup for these angled sections on the container. We're going to repeat exactly the same technique as we've just used with exactly the same pieces of the template that we've just used, starting with the larger panels. A little bit of glue, stick it in place, repeat the process for the smaller panels and you'll end up looking like this. If you've got holes like I have, don't worry about them, we're going to take care of them in a bit. These templates are designed with 1mm substrates in mind. You can see I'm using chipboard which is a little bit bigger than that. So I'm going to need to make a slight adjustment to this piece here. All I'm going to need to do is just trim a little tiny piece away from all 8 sides, then a little bit of glue and it will fit snugly exactly where it needs to go. Oh, and when we picked a top and a bottom earlier, these pieces inside this particular octagon should be vertical, i.e. pointing towards the top. And don't forget to do both ends. Now we need some filler. I've got some old pieces of plastic card. And it really is as simple as just filling in the gaps between all the pieces of card we've added to the main structure. Then we can turn our attention to those angled sections until they look like this. I have sanded this, but not a great deal. In the way that I'm going to paint it, I'll be able to enhance the textures that are left from the filler. And I've cut out all those little details from earlier. These ribs need to be 6mm wide. I've decided to cut a small strip of the substrate and glue the two pieces of rib together to form one whole piece. There's no bit on the template for these strips. Depending on your substrate, you're going to need a different size. It's up to you to work that out. Doing it this way does make them much easier to glue onto the container. Then back to filler and sanding to tidy everything up before we turn our attention to the feet. What you're going to do is make a sandwich out of these three pieces while lining up this 45-degree angle. Then sticking this part to an extra piece of spare substrate until they look like this. Once they're all glued in place, it's time to just make sure everything's level. Just take a spare piece of substrate, slip it underneath the container, and make sure all the feet are nice and flat. After attaching all 8 feet, you will end up with this. Then after raiding my bit box and making sure everything was primed, I filled in all the flat colours and added a few transfers ready for weathering. But just before I start weathering, I did add a little stencil to the top of this container. For some reason, I've got into the habit of doing this on all the containers that I make now. Now time for my secret weapon when it comes to weathering, Army Painter Speed Paint, in this instance Gravelord Grey. And it's just a case of slapping it on everywhere. Then, once it's dried, we need a small pot of water and some cotton buds. And then it's time to do the one thing that everybody hates about Army Painter Speed Paints, and that is reactivating it to take quite a bit of it away. This leaves some really interesting weathering patterns, and I add to that further by stippling on some of the original primer colour with a small piece of scourer from a sponge, just to bring in a few lighter tones and help add to the contrast. And I repeat that process with a brown just where rust may accumulate. The penultimate step is adding some Vallejo rust texture to those areas where I think water might pool, and then to emphasise that even more and to add to the contrast, I'm using a very thin orange wash in the darkest recesses. Before I number, date and sign it, as I do with all of my builds. After filming this build, I did update the template one more time to include these 2 circles, so that if your bitbox allows it, you can include things like this. If you're after another cheap and easy build with free templates, check out this video.